Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to give it a couple seconds, let everyone get filtered in here, and then we'll get started for today. Alrighty, I see that number jumping up pretty quick, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the live webinar, Mastering Organizational Design, Avoiding Critical Pitfalls to Ensure Success. Before we get started, just want to extend a big thank you to Queen's IRC for sponsoring this webinar today. I'd like to acknowledge our webinar sponsor as well. For over 88 years, Queen's IRC has been a leader in professional development, training in labor relations, human resources, and organizational development, equipping professionals with practical skills they can apply right away. Joining us today is IRC facilitator Mark Coulter. If you're looking to advance your career, I encourage you to explore what Queen's IRC has to offer. I'm Alex Uretsky, Digital Media Project Specialist for Annex Business Media, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Before I pass it over to your speaker, just like to take care of a few housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded. So for any reason you have to leave early or you miss part of the presentation, a link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants shortly. Secondly, the audience is in listen-only mode, so cameras and microphones will be turned off for you. However, the chat and Q&A function are open to you, and any questions you may have can and should be submitted into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer any questions at the end of today's session. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker for today, Mark Coulter. Mark Coulter brings over 20 years of experience in human resources working across industries such as retail, consumer goods, and consulting. His expertise includes implementing end-to-end talent management and organizational development solutions in talent acquisition, performance management, employee and leadership development, succession planning, career development, culture integration, and organizational design. Just as an FYI, Mark is experiencing some technical difficulties today, so his camera will be turned off. And if there's any disruptions during the webinar, please just bear with us and we'll make sure everything gets right back on track. Without any further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Mark for his presentation.
Thank you, Alex. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm sorry I can't see you on camera, but looking forward to spending some time with you to discuss organizational design and how you, as a practitioner, can avoid some of the critical pitfalls to ensure success. So I want to start off with a little bit of a situational assessment here. And the unfortunate reality is that many organizations use organizational design at the wrong time, in the wrong way, with the wrong process. And this leads to some unfortunate situations: poor and unrealized results, disengaged employees, unrealized benefits. And you may actually make the situation even worse, leading to what I call a culture of chaos and damaged trust and faith in leadership. And here are some sobering stats. A study by McKinsey reported that many organizational redesign efforts fail to achieve objectives. 82% haven't experienced a redesign, but 75% of those redesign efforts have failed, and nearly 50% of executives say their redesigns were abandoned before they were even completed. So this is a sobering reality, to say the least. So love to find out, in terms of some comments, and this is just a simple yes or no: have you experienced a failed redesign at your organization? But I don't want to be a Debbie Downer by any means, and the good news is that success is possible. And McKinsey reported that when redesigns are successful, organizations have experienced many positive benefits, including improved performance management, better business processes, improved spans of control, and improved culture, just to name a few. So today, we want to help you become a better organization designer. And the way in which we're going to do that is to explore 3 challenges. The first one is, why is a design even needed? The second one is, what makes a good design? And finally, how can you avoid the common pitfalls that many organizational designers make? So first of all, why is a design needed? So I want to start off with some of the foundational principles when we think about this. So in other words, the first principle you want to think about is strategy. The organizational structure needs to fit and match the strategy of the organization to be effective. The second one is, Don't wait until it's too late to redesign your organization. And the third foundational point is organizational design may not be the right solution, meaning don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. So I want to start off with a really cool quote by Sir John Brown. Our strategy is our organization. In the old days, company had the luxury of stable, long-lived strategies. No longer. Strategies continue to shift to reflect changing market conditions. Organizations that succeed have structures that are supple and adaptable as the strategies they reflect. So this is a real interesting quote that shows the importance of ensuring your design reflects the changing strategies of your organization. Let's talk a little bit more about the current realities. So today, the demands in business are unprecedented. Organizational success requires leaders to balance conflicting priorities, including becoming more efficient while driving innovation, expanding globally while addressing local needs, and enhancing growth while ensuring sustainability. Shareholders expect more, customers expect more, and companies need to deliver. Global companies are facing economic uncertainty, weakening global growth, shifting trade policies and tariffs, elevated interest rates, and inflation. And finally, AI disruption, supply chain risks, and evolving consumer behaviors are forcing organizations to be more agile. Wow, that's a lot of information. So in a nutshell, organizations who can continuously adapt and reimagine how they deliver value are at a significant advantage. And this means, based on Sir John's quote, you need to have a structure that adapts and responds to the strategic priorities your organization is facing. So I want to start off with some straightforward scenarios. So when you think about organizational design, there's some straightforward scenarios that are going to necessitate a design. And here's a few. When an organization changes their strategy is one. When there's a startup of a new business, when there's significant growth or contraction, when there's a shift from being a domestic company to being a global or multinational organization, when you have a merger or an acquisition, or finally, when you have a spin-off or a divestiture. So these are the common scenarios that would necessitate an organizational redesign. But I want to talk a little bit more about some design triggers that are not so obvious and can easily be missed. So existing organizational designs can lose relevance as market conditions change, leadership changes, or processes change. These changes may occur slowly, sneaking up on the company and accumulating to the point where a redesign is needed. And the key problem disconnects in key processes as they flow across different departments or work groups, difficulty obtaining or sharing resources, lengthy decision-making processes, role confusion or turf issues, increased turnover, productivity declines. So these are triggers, if you will, that may indicate something is boiling below the surface that you need to address. And so these are all indicators that point to a fragmentation in the smooth flow of information, materials, or decision-making. And so leaders need to monitor these signs and initiate redesign efforts sooner, not later. In other words, don't wait too late. Also, a point to note here is when employees and leaders begin to talk about communications problems in their organization, it's important to take note because often the root cause of communication problems is an inappropriate structure, either at the macro or the micro level, leading to inefficiencies or inconsistencies in terms of the way information moves across the organization to get work done. So we've talked about where design is needed, and we've talked about 8 design triggers that are often missed. But I want to go into the last topic of this section, which is sometimes a design is not the right solution for every problem. And I want to use an analogy to make this point. So you need to investigate the problems in the business before starting the design work. Another way to look at this is, would you redesign your entire bathroom if all you needed to do was fix a leaky pipe? Well, you probably wouldn't. So it's quite possible that you may have the right boxes or the right people reporting to the right managers, but there may be a job duty or a process issue that needs to be performed differently or better. So in this case, It might be something that's solved by a coaching, training, or accountability issue. So think leaky pipe, and not a redesign issue. Think redesigning your bathroom. So if you go down the redesign path, you can cause a lot of commotion and you may still end up with a leaky pipe. So all of that being said, make sure that the design is the right solution for the problems you have in your organization. To build off this point and kind of summarize this section is, when is a design required? So here's a quick checklist. Yes, when you have a change in strategy, 100%. Declining organizational results, as we talked about, that's an indicator that you may need to redesign your organization. When there's a merger, new process or technology, maybe, maybe not. In some cases, it may require design. In some cases, it may not. Individual or team performance issue that can be resolved another way. So that example of a leaky pipe, that you wouldn't do a design in that scenario, and you never do a design just because your leader wants to do it, or just because it's a rainy day. Make sure that you're using organizational design in the right way at the right time with the right method. So now I want to talk a little bit about challenge number 2, which is, what makes a good design? How do we know we have a good organizational design? The foundations of this section are thinking like an architect, and the design must address the organizational need. So to start off, when you're an architect and you begin redesigning a house, you need to determine the type of building you need. So in other words, is it a 1-bedroom house? Is it an office building? Is it 1 level or multiple levels? How many bathrooms does it need to have? How many fire exits? What materials are you going to use? So in other words, in order to build the right house, you need to determine the needs or specifications first. So what does a good design look like? And I think oftentimes, as practitioners, we sometimes do not reflect on what are the foundations of making a design really effective. So in general, effective organizational structures are those that eliminate bureaucracy. They simplify the work. They make it more engaging for employees to work in that environment. They promote collaboration, not silos. They promote collaboration, meaning working across silos. They leverage talent. They leverage the skills and capabilities of people, and they establish systems to share knowledge. And so how well organizations align their structures, processes, management systems, and cultures with a well-articulated strategy greatly impacts their ability to execute and achieve bottom line results. So one of the key things that you want to think about when you think about addressing your design needs is, going back to that analogy of being an architect, you need to determine the right design for your organization. So once you've done an assessment of the current state and learn more about the needs, you can develop the design criteria. In other words, what are the specifications for the house you're going to build? What does the future state organization need to look like? And the best way to do that is to start with design criteria. And this is where many OD practitioners go wrong. The design criteria are like the specifications for the design. In other words, it's 4 to 6 statements about the future state organization, and expresses the desired capabilities and characteristics of the future organization. So in other words, what does the organization need to do to be successful? And the purpose of this is really fourfold. Clarifies what the design must do well, identifies the problems to be solved, ensures alignment prior to actual design, which is really important, and develops a benchmark to use when evaluating options. So in other words, unless you have specific criteria up front, it's hard to evaluate which of the design options are the most effective for your organization. So just like an architect, don't start building until you have alignment on what the design is supposed to accomplish up front. So some of the key design principles you want to think about as an organizational design practitioner were developed by Gould and Campbell in their book, Designing Effective Organizations. And organizational design is a tug of war between these 5 principles, and I'll explain a little bit more as I walk through this. So principle number 1 is about specialization. And so what does this mean? This means that there should be boundaries that exist to encourage the development of specialist skills. So if you have a specialist culture in your organization that needs to be different from the rest of the organization, they need to be protected from the dominant culture. So let's take, for example, a specialized team within your IT department. So let's assume it's the network security team. The specialist principle encourages the development of specialized skills and ensures that the team is well equipped to handle its specific area of expertise. And this will help them be more efficient, innovative, and allow them to leverage their expertise within the organization. So a key word or theme to think about when you think about specialization is don't paint everyone with the same brush. In other words, in some cases, the design and the needs of a department may look different than the dominant culture. Principle number 2, and this one is where a lot of organizations fall down, is the coordination between departments is very, very hard to do. And the larger your organization, the more complex your organization, the harder that coordination between departments is. So the principle here states that similar activities should be coordinated in a single unit to make it easier. So in some cases, it could be centralized functions into a center of excellence, or there could be coordinating functions or overlay units that make sure that information is shared appropriately across multiple functions or departments. So an example here is accounts payable or accounts receivable. So rather than having these departments separate in an organization, it's best to have them centralized to ensure the better coordination of people and tasks and a better customer experience for those internal departments that are being served. So the idea here is make coordination easy, because if it's easier, then it'll be much more efficient and effective. Principle number 3, knowledge and competence. So what does this mean? This means that responsibility should be allocated to the person or team best fit to do them. Pretty straightforward. So tasks, higher level tasks should be retained by higher levels of the organization to ensure that you're leveraging the skill sets and you're not creating compression in your organization. So higher level tasks allocated to senior roles, lower level tasks allocated to lower roles in the organization. So an example of this is your CEO should not be involved in every decision, especially not decisions that involve specialists with much more deep or extensive subject matter expertise. So your CEO does not have to be involved in making engineering decisions or finance decisions or HR decisions. They're involved in making the big picture strategic decisions impacting the organization and the organizational strategy moving forward. So the quick snippet to remember out of this one is the right functions and levels should do the work in your organization. The next one, control and commitment. And as you can see, we talked about conflicting priorities here. This is one that's an example of that. This principle is about having effective controls on one hand while maintaining engagement and commitment on the other. So there's always a balance. So going back to, the goals of an effective organization is to be efficient, effective, be well coordinated, to execute in accordance to the goals of your function or the organization as a whole. So the test here is to have a control process that is aligned with the unit's responsibility, is cost effective and motivating for people. So an example of this is, rather than having 20-page policies for everything in your organization, companies like Netflix adopted a freedom with accountability model. And what that means is that rather than having extensive policies, procedures, and guidelines, the organization implemented simple, memorable practices to ensure that they operated within certain guardrails. So there's no need to burden the organization with extensive process or approval if they could be designed in another way to ensure that employees are committed, are aligned, and the work still gets done. And the last one is innovation and adaptation. And this is a critical one, specifically in today's world. And this principle states that organizational structures should be sufficiently flexible to adapt. So in other words, they shouldn't be so rigid that they can't move and flex based on the needs of the customer or the external market. And the test here is that the organizational design should enable the development of new strategies and adaptation to future changes. So an example of this is think about a retail company that was a traditional bricks and mortar store, and then COVID hit. So they needed to pivot quickly. And so they need to be flexible and adaptable to meet the changing needs of their customers. And the underlying principle with this one is rigid structures don't do well in changing times. So the third challenge is how to avoid common design pitfalls. And the foundations I want to talk about in this section is perfect doesn't exist. And so perfect is the enemy of good, is the enemy of great. There is no perfect design. There's a better design based on your need. So organizational design is about continuous learning. So meaning that, I love this quote here by Leo Tolstoy, if you look for perfection, you'll never be content. Perfection is really an illusion. So I want to talk about some pitfalls to avoid. And the first one I love, because this is a common pitfall that occurs. You've probably experienced this before where a leader comes into your office and says, I've got the best design for my function or for the organization as a whole. I've taken the organizational charts, I've moved people, I've moved boxes, I've created departments, I've created functions. And you look at that and they're thinking, geez, we'll go ahead and implement that structure. And so here, when you think about an organizational chart, what's important to note is that it is an outcome of the organizational design process, but it's a really simplistic one. The organizational design doesn't take into consideration, or sorry, the organizational chart doesn't take into consideration the processes, the systems, the talent, the skills, the capabilities required to achieve the objectives. And so you need to think beyond the organizational chart and think broadly about how do we get people to be effective in that new design. And organizational redesigns provide a really good opportunity to examine critical processes. So what are your pain points you're trying to address? And when you look at the pain points, it's important to identify what those root causes are. And so then ultimately, when you put together the new organizational design, which does include an organizational chart, you'll be looking at ways in which to become even more effective at those core processes by taking consideration the talent, the rewards, the goals, decision making, etc. So look beyond the organizational chart and think about how people need to behave and interact to ensure they bring the design objectives to life once you go live. Pitfall number 2, we talked about this one before, is the idea of ensuring that your design connects with strategy. And many leaders think they have a really good strategy, but a lot of times that strategy isn't really cascaded or communicated down to managers and employees, and they don't really understand what that strategy is and how that impacts their day-to-day work. So in practical terms, a strategy is really about the organization's plans to differentiate itself from competitors on the basis of products, markets, technology, pricing, or people. So without a clear strategy, it's easy to get into the idea of moving boxes around. So what to do instead is start with your strategy, develop your design criteria, as we talked about before, which is the specific outcomes you're looking to achieve, and then test your design options using this criteria to determine the right design that fits your strategy. Pitfall number 3, relying on external benchmarks. And I've been down this road many, many times where a leader will come to me and say, look, I just saw the new Gartner or PwC or whoever that has released a recommended strategy for a retail sales organization, etc. And then they say, well, geez, the only thing that we need to do is just implement this strategy here. And so it's a wrong assumption to think that there's a perfect design template out there. There's no perfect structures. Every business is different. And what's important is to have to get the right people or to engage the right leaders in the design process to make the right design choices based on your unique strategy. Plug and play approaches from a journal or a publication will not lead to success. Pitfall number 4, and I love this one because a lot of times we don't consider this. I mean, you think about being in an organization design, you need to look holistically about how that design is going to work once it's implemented. And so organizations frequently overlook how their cultural DNA affects organizational design effectiveness. And a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers reported that 86% of CEOs believe culture is a competitive advantage, yet only 12% believe they are driving the right culture. And this disconnect creates a significant barrier to effective organizational design. So what to do instead? A successful design must integrate seamlessly with the company's culture rather than fight against it. And so without cultural alignment, even the best structure on paper will face resistance in implementation strategies. And it's important to remember that employees will either bring or not bring that design to life. And so, in other words, make sure that the design is going to fit your culture because it's employees that are going to bring that structure to life at the end of the day. And finally, neglecting decision rights and accountabilities. And so kind of going back to that whole premise of, starting with your organizational charts and just thinking that that's design. Research shows that decision rights and accountabilities are twice as powerful as structure in driving organizational effectiveness. But many organizations lack clarity about what decisions need to be made, who is responsible, and how the decision-making process should proceed. So this ambiguity is the primary cause of delays and bottlenecks. Yes, you need to document the from and to accountabilities, responsibilities, making sure that people are clear on what they need to do in their role in the new structure. And it's also important to make sure you have the right talent capabilities. Decisions are made in order to optimize the design once it is implemented. And this is critical because going back to that point before is yes, the design needs to support your culture. But at the end of the day, employees and leaders are going to bring that design to life through their day-to-day interactions. So it's easy to identify the future state structure and implement it. It's much harder to make sure that that structure comes to life, that people know exactly what they need to do when they need to do it, and that the results are sustained, which is a part of organizational design that a lot of people forget. So to summarize, we talked about why a design is needed, what makes a good design, and how to avoid some common design pitfalls. And that was all for the formal part of the presentation. I really do apologize. That is a real picture of me. I apologize you can't see me today. But I do want to make sure that I open up to questions. And hopefully my internet will stay secure long enough for me to respond.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks for getting through that with us. Appreciate it. Got a question here. They're asking, are there any tips for a public service organization structure which is hierarchical and not at all agile or able to adapt quickly?
When you say tips, I guess the question that I would first have is, what organization, what challenges you're looking to solve, and if there are certain parameters that you're operating under, is making sure that you're considering those. I understand that unionized environments are very different. Government organizations are also operate very differently, and there are certain considerations around hierarchy, etc. I think the whole piece around design is really finding the design that solves your problem. So making sure that You have clear understanding of, I'll call it, what's within scope and what's out of scope. And then also making sure you align with leaders about, I'll call it, what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable. I think there's opportunities to revamp organizational structures to achieve different results, even if you have parameters that you're working under. So I think that's something to consider. You just may not necessarily be as, I'll call it, innovative or progressive in terms of the design, you're looking to accomplish. In other words, you may not necessarily be able to implement a fully flat or agile organizational structure, but that doesn't mean you can't implement flexible or adaptable structure within your environment. I hope I
Perfect.
answered that. Okay.
I think so. That was a good answer. Got another one here asking, are the design criteria, sorry, this one, sorry, if you could resubmit that question there, that one just is worded a little bit oddly. The next one is, if you could just give one piece of advice to an executive team in the midst of restructuring an 80-person company, one which previously had an excellent culture until the last partial restructuring, what would it be?
Wow. That's a powerful one. Considering a last partial restructuring. So I think my first point there would be what was the impact of that last organizational structure? I think that's something that sometimes leadership teams forget. If the culture was preserved, if people's feedback was considered, if it was implemented fairly, if it led to good results, then people may have a much more of a positive or optimistic feeling going into the second restructure. But if it didn't go well, I think executive teams need to recognize that and really reflect to make sure that one, we're doing it for the right reasons, we're doing it in the right way, and we're also using some of those key cultural priorities or considerations as part of the decisions that we're making. So the other principle that I would, also I also consider is the right time trumps the right thing. So making sure that it's the right time to do this, that people are supported, and that you don't neglect and forget what happened in the past so that you don't make the same mistakes if you did make some mistakes before.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
I've got another one here asking, can you provide a specific example where an org design did not align with the culture?
Oh, that is a great one. Um, oh wow, you're really testing me right now to think on the spot. Um, Organizational design did not. Yes, I can describe one, and I'll describe one that is direct from my experience. When we had a new CEO that came into place, and basically said, we need to streamline this organization. Myself, my boss, and he were locked up in a room for hours. And he basically looked at the organizational chart and said, here's where we're cutting boxes. And so it was very awkward for me because I was obviously not at the same level as the CEO, and he had a clear mandate. It was a privately held organization, which made it more complex. And basically, the goal was purely cost cutting. So it wasn't looking at how are we going to do the work once we have fewer bodies or fewer employees. That's a better word. It was purely about how do I get the biggest bang for my buck from a cost reduction. And the implication of that was destructive because there was no consideration for talent that we needed to preserve. There was no consideration for what happened to the survivors, meaning sometimes there was quote unquote a 2-for-1 where employees were doing one job, now they had amalgamated job. And there was no consideration for how do we make sure that we are in a better place tomorrow than we are today. And I think that's the line of sight that a lot of people need to think about is an organizational design can be put into place. You can save $10 today, but if it costs you $100, 4, 5, 6 months from now, it's a bad decision. So really taking a look at the long-term considerations is something that's extremely important. So that's an example of one that just, it didn't work. And unfortunately, it created a bit of I'll call it a culture of chaos after that was implemented.
Awesome. That was a great example. Thank you, Mark.
Welcome.
Got another one here asking, can organizational design be used to influence culture change within an organization, specifically if the current culture is a roadblock for being agile and effective?
I told 100%, 100%. And I think that's I think what's really important is, yes, you can look at where's our culture today and how does the design support it. And you can also look at, how do we use the design to test out new ways of working that align to our expected future state organization. So I think they do go together. So for example, if you're going to implement a more agile way of working, there's no reason in the world that you can't take a look at your organizational design and figure out ways in which you can become more agile to support the goals of your culture. The big piece is you want to make sure that there is alignment, because culture is about values, it's about behaviors, it's about expectations. It's the way people, it's how people feel about work. It's the expectations. And so making sure that your structure, your roles, your accountabilities, and the expectations on behaviors and decisions are aligned, can really bring a new culture to life in a positive way.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Um,
Welcome.
Got another one here. They're asking, can you provide a few examples of good design criteria statements? They know that these will be organization specific, but perhaps
Mhm.
there are some that are more standard that can be used.
Yeah, I would not, so I'll just kind of clarify that one a little bit. I would not in any way, shape, or form say there's standard or design criteria. And what I mean by that is going back to that idea of every organization is different. Every organization is at a different, does services different customers, has different challenges, has different strengths, different people. So the design criteria needs to reflect where the organization is and where they want to be. Design criteria should be something along the line about what you intend to accomplish. So, for example, written in sort of a smart format, if you will, for those HR people on the call, is that, you know, um, we want to support an agile way of working to ensure that we break down silos and foster collaboration between marketing and sales. This is just an example, a rough one. But you want to make sure it's specific enough and measurable enough to do two things. One is that the leaders align to those principles. Two, that when you develop design options, and I'm a big believer of developing more than one design options, and that's I think what happens with some organizational design practitioners is they think, let's just present the one option to the organization that we think is the best. I'm not a believer in that. I think it's important for us to develop multiple options, use the design criteria to say, how does this structure support the goals of the organization, and you use the design criteria to evaluate effectiveness and make a recommendation on the one you think is best and why. So the design criteria also allows you to ensure that you're evaluating the degree to which the design is going to accomplish your end state or your overall goals. So all that being said, it's important for it to be specific, measurable, and objective, so that when you are sitting down with the leadership team and you're discussing the options, you're deciding on the right one. Because it's very easy for leaders to potentially have different vantage points or opinions about what the design should or should not do. The design criteria allows you to facilitate a discussion to make sure that people are aligned, which is what you want. You want people to be aligned on what are we really trying to accomplish, how are we going to get there, so that you make better decisions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. That is the last question that we have.
Oh,
So before we wrap up, I just wanted to invite you all to explore Queen IRC's upcoming organizational design program, taking place November 12th to 14th in Toronto. In this program, you'll learn how to design agile, high-performing organizations by bridging cutting-edge theory with practical tools to align structure, strategy, and people for lasting impact. The organizations that succeed tomorrow are being designed today, so make sure you're the one leading the change by registering for a Queen's IRC program. And as I previously stated, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the webinar today. I just wanted to once again extend a thank you to Queen's IRC for sponsoring this webinar today. Also, just wanted to extend a big thank you to our speaker, Mark, once again for working through those technical issues with you. Really appreciate you being here to give the presentation. Finally, just want to extend a big thank you to the audience for your questions and participation, as well as your patience. Watch your inboxes for a link to the recording and any answers to your questions from today's session. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great and safe day.